All right, welcome to episode 95 of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitrov. Thomas, we made it through the preseason. There are some injuries, but for the most part, we don't have anybody season tanked because of a preseason injury. So I feel like, we're in a good spot here. We have this whole bye week to get to the regular season, which starts not this weekend, but the next weekend. So we're in kind of a cool kind of middle of the preseason, regular season trough here. I'm excited, man. It dawned on me this weekend that football is here and it's here to stay. Thomas, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Watched the Notre Dame game. We're talking Ireland, watching Navy and Notre Dame. Now that was kind of a tough one, but I know our guy Sean Clement was all over that win. But usually the kickoff of the college season really rolls me into the NFL for some reason. I don't know why it is. I get all hyped up over it. Look, you guys were in Vegas. Don't try to avoid that. I want to hear more about Vegas. I want to hear a little bit more about Circa Sports. How did that go?
Yeah, it was a really good time. Circa is, the premier, I think, premier gaming enterprise in Las Vegas now. They bought Derek Stevens, the owner, bought a really cool property in Old Vegas right next to the D. He built it up. He put in a world-class sports book. He put in the Vegas Sports and Information Network studio, which is a studio it's a network that I do a decent amount of work with, and as well as they put up Stadium Swim, which is this place where you can go outside, enjoy the games, play some blackjack, play some poker, things like that. And it's really fun. They were doing their preview for their signups, so they were signing people up for their Millions competition, which is a pick 5 games every week competition, as well as their Survivor competition, which is a pick 1 team to win every single week. And you don't get to repeat teams. So that was pretty cool. I was on a panel at the very end to talk about kind of previewing the season. And then we were there handing out merch. If you go to our YouTube page, youtube.com/@SumerSports, we have some podcast related material from that weekend. But it was a good time. People are excited about what we're doing here at Sumer. People wondering where you were, Thomas. I said, look, he's a busy guy, and he'll make it out there one of these times. But it was a good time, and I really enjoyed the positive, Sumer response, as well as just being out there and seeing some people I haven't seen in a while.
No, I love that. And you guys were talking about it earlier on today. I mean, Circa Sports, you have such a fondness for them and love being there and hanging out with our group there. I'm glad, as much as I like hearing that you like Circa Sports and you're behind them. Here we are, no Circa Sport tatted over your forehead.
All I had to do was do a panel for them. It was worth and we obviously did ad reads, by the way. We are available for additional sponsors now, including we'll keep our relationship with Circa for a while. But if you are interested in sponsoring this podcast, you know where to find me. It was a really good time, and it's always fun to talk to people who I always think about it this way, like. You were a general manager in the league for 12 and a half years. You were a director of college scouting for another, 10 years or so. And you were a scout for even longer than that. You have real skin in the game. I love, and on the same side, I love talking to people who bet their actual money on sports, because again, like, nothing sharpens the mind like risk, right? When you go out and trade up for Julio Jones, you put this career that you work so hard for on the line, and hence I always give quite a bit more credence to somebody like that than somebody who's just spouting opinions. Similar stuff with bettors, right? Like, folks who put, their real hard-earned money on the line with their opinions, to me, I think deserve deserve my ear for a little bit. And the folks at Circa are both sides, obviously taking bets, as well as folks there who are giving them that action. So it was a really fun time. It gave us week 3 of the preseason as well, Thomas, where we saw a few things happen. We saw, on the eve of the final game of the preseason, Dallas traded a 4th-round pick to the San Francisco 49ers for quarterback Trey Lance, who was the 3rd overall pick in the 2021 draft. So now only Zach Wilson is the first quarterback to be a backup on the team that drafted him in year 3 since Matt Leinart. We also saw the Browns cutting Cade York, a kicker that they took with a 4th-round pick last year. Jake Moody, a 3rd-round pick for the 49ers, is battling out with Zane Gonzalez. I kind of want to start there. I know we've litigated the Trey Lance thing a bunch of times, and we don't really – I mean, look, it's a mess, but I also respect the 49ers for getting off of it, moving on, even though, a lot of teams would hold on to him and hope that he came around. But we haven't really talked about this kicker thing. Kickers are just a tough sell, right? You even know this from your experience, Thomas. Like Younghoe Koo was kind of a disaster for the Chargers, at least early, missing game-winning kicks and all that kind of stuff. Goes to the AAF, kicks, now he's and then I believe you signed him, right? Or he came to the Falcons in 2020, I believe. And now he's one of the best kickers in all of football. Conversely, you have guys like Daniel Carlson, who were cut by the team that drafted him, that are now pretty good. You have guys like, Roberto Aguayo, who was picked in the 2nd round by the Bucs, never had much of an NFL career. All this is to say is kickers are incredibly important, but they're also extremely hard to predict. And so I just have a really hard time. It'd be like we went to a car dealership, Thomas, and you had no inspections on the car. And yet I'm supposed to pay high-end prices for a car that I get so I can't tell the difference between whether this one's new, this one's used, and default, all this kind of stuff. It feels like that's what kickers like at the NFL level, and yet we still have teams that draft them.
Wow, I go all the way back to earlier years in scouting, and then becoming a personnel director, and then a GM. And I've never been one that has been bullish on drafting kickers or punters, to be honest with you. I mean, look, I know how incredibly important they are, massively important in those winning days. Of course, I've been around organizations, whether it was the Patriots, whether earlier years in Atlanta, when we had kickers that we were bringing in that were free agents who have kicked for a long time. There are some really good kickers out there that you can get at a good value, right? I'm not trying to compare kickers to running backs, far from that. But I'm just saying there are a lot of really good kickers out there that I think that you can pull off, off the road sometimes, off the street, so to speak, and bring them in, and they can kick well for you. I used to look at it as when you draft a kicker or a punter, but let's say a kicker, for instance, in the top 3 rounds, I used to think that as being quite arrogant of the team that did that, thinking, wow, you're going to take a kicker where you have that many opportunities to pull someone off the street, and you're going to draft a kicker that high when you need A, B, and C and X, Y, and Z on your roster. So yeah. I'm not saying I'm totally against it. I know there's a place for it, but I've never been into it. And here's a situation where you might have, the Browns cut a kicker. I like what the Browns do often. They're a smart football team, and they're doing the right thing, but now they have to turn on it. Just like Jason Light had to do. Andrew Berry had to do at Cleveland. Now Jason Light had to do at Tampa Bay. Those are tough moves to make as a general manager, right? You stick it out there, you talk with your head coach, and you guys both agree on it, and then you have to pull away and end up cutting a player that high, and you obviously don't get the best out of it, and that's a tough thing to have happen.
Yeah, I'm looking right now at a figure by my friend Josh Norris, who works for Underdog Fantasy. These are the kickers that have been drafted since 2016, Thomas. Roberto Aguayo, Harrison Butker, which again, this is, I think, where it gets weird. Harrison Butker was drafted by the Panthers. He's a 2-time Super Bowl champion for the Chiefs. Jake Elliott was drafted in that same draft by the Bengals. He's a 1-time Super Bowl champion that year, 2017, for the Eagles. I think Caleb Sturgis got hurt, and he got in there. Daniel Carlson is the top 2 kicker in the league. He was drafted by the Vikings and then cut after 2 games. I get a little bit weirded out here because I, like you, think the Browns are a smart group. I mean, I'm a huge fan of, obviously, of Paul D. Podesta, Andrew Healy, obviously Andrew Berry, Kwesi was there for a while. Just really smart people. And yet I see the Browns repeated on year 3 times, and none of these guys are going to make it to year 2 with the team. So I get a little bit worried there that they keep repeating that mistake. Tyler, you have some examples of a guys being good, like Tyler Bass and Evan McPherson was pretty good as a rookie for the Bengals. But even look at like Matt Gay. Matt Gay is the first kicker taken in 2019. He replaced in 2021 Sam Sloman, who was the last kicker taken in 2020 and won a Super Bowl in 2021 for the Rams. To me, it's just, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen here. To me, it's just, it's not even, it's just a problem. Like, it's so hard to evaluate these guys because no one who's like you're a scout, you're a scout. You played defensive back in college. I played tight end in college. Rarely any of us, even any of us with decent football minds like me or great football minds like yours, we've never been in the headspace of a kicker.
No,
we don't know what that's like, and it's totally different. And so we can evaluate how strong of a leg they are. We can but sometimes it's just as much as like Daniel Carlson probably hated. There was something about playing in Minnesota that made a headspace for Daniel Carlson difficult, and there was something like playing in Oakland and Vegas that made it easier. And it's just so mechanical now that I don't know if you can predict that pre-draft.
You can't. And remember this, most teams, like you said, they have an understanding of kickers. And yet we always, as scouts, as personnel directors, as general managers, as head coaches, we would defer to the special teams coach more than anything, right? There's some unbelievable special teams coaches who know every little nuance and intricate element to the kickers and their approach, and we rely on them. If you rely on the special team coach too much, however, and say, for instance, that this player is worth a second round or a third round and we'll never see the likes of this again, I think you have to be careful with that. That's all I'm saying. Respectfully to some of the special teams coaches I have awesome respect for. My feeling is you just have to be very, very careful with that. And I continue to think about it. I mean, look, you look at Cleveland right now, like you said, great deal of respect for him. Really, really like Andrew Berry, like Paul DiPodesto, who drafted the kicker at Kansas City and is now with the Cleveland Browns. You're who was a GM at Kansas
City? John Dorsey.
Of course it was John, right? So John's got experience on that side, right? So interesting. I'd just be interested to see how that conversation went with Andrew Berry and John Dorsey talking about what had happened. And
let's back this up a tad, because I love this topic, because John Dorsey was a fantastic drafter, right? Sure. When you look at Kansas City during his time, he was the one. Now everybody will take different credit for Mahomes, but like 17 was his final draft with the Chiefs. That's obviously Mahomes. Kareem Hunt's a rushing champion. They had good players there. 16, they traded back and then got Chris Jones in round 2. They had Tyreek Hill in the 5th round of 2016. Eric Fisher was a pretty good left tackle. Like John Dorsey did wonderful things picking players, and yet like his weakness was in many ways managing the salary cap. And then, there are other people who, like, I think Cleveland, for example, is tremendous at picking, certain positions. I think Indianapolis, when you look at Chris Ballard, really good at picking certain positions. As a general manager, do you ever think about, you look at Pittsburgh, the history of the Steelers, right? Goldberg all the way to Kahn. Have they ever missed at hitting a wide receiver? I don't remember if they have. Do you think, and this is where we can help at Sumer Sports, I think, do you think that there is a credence to this idea that general managers have a wheelhouse that they're really good at, and then something like Sumer or something else can help not only identify but also help with weaknesses? Because I think it's probably hard to be a general manager who's a 10 out of 10 at everything.
Yeah, none are 10 out of 10 out of everything. Some have a staff that they're smart about. If they're smart about putting their staff together, if they know what their weakness is in evaluating, they'll make sure that they have the right people in place who are in their ear talking about some of those areas they may not feel that comfortable. I will tell you, most general managers are rarely going to admit where they're lacking, right? They don't want it out in the media. They don't want it out in the public. but some of them know where their focus is and where their passion is. So look, I think it's really, really important to make sure that you have the right people around you, of course, when you're making the decisions. And I do agree, some people thrive in certain areas and they can hit on them. What I think Sumer can do, quite honestly, is go to the general managers who are open-minded enough to know that they're not an 8 or a 9 in every position evaluation ability, and maybe take the 6s and 5s, and just in grading scale, that's adequate and good. They don't have to be top tier. And then I think a company like Sumer can run all the data they need to run and help them in the areas that they really need to work on, and help them potentially present them with opportunities to make better decisions, of course, because this comes back to the augmentation idea that we've talked about many, many times, right? You're on that side of creating, knowing data as well as you do, creating something for a general manager like myself or other GM friends of mine, that you can help them see more in depth and make better, more sort of thought out decisions on some of the areas that they may not be as adept at evaluating.
Ryan Nelson, one of our loyal listeners, says Cowboys with their offensive line pick since 2011. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at, there's a couple Hall of Famers in there. I think you look at the Eagles with the defensive line; they've rarely ever missed there. You'd have to go back to maybe Mike Mamula the last time they missed on a defensive lineman, which will sort of take you back.
You know where I'm going to go here. However, you look at those teams and you look at the coaches that they have at those positions, and I guarantee you they are going to be at the top tier, top 5 in the league normally, if they're a top 5, with the best coach at that position. They know how to develop, and that is a really, really important thing to get the most out of your talent.
Yeah, for sure. For those who are watching live, just to give you kind of at least a little bit of a heads up, it's raining sideways outside in Atlanta right now. And I don't know if you're hearing that out of Thomas. Probably not Thomas's house. Thomas's house probably has a few more layers than mine does. But so if we do punch out here, it's going to be because, we've lost power in either Alpharetta or Buckhead. But I love that. And it's funny because you are one of the more introspective, I would say, leaders that that I've ever met. Right. And even with you're saying, like, it's going to be hard for a general manager to admit, maybe not publicly, but maybe to a third party, saying like, hey, New England, for example, and obviously every time we talk about Bill Belichick, everybody's got to know one of the best team builders of all time, probably the best head coach of all time. But when you look at their history of drafting wide receivers, it's much different than their history of drafting linemen and defensive players. And, there was a time when they would just go out and trade for those players like Brandon Cooks and stuff like that, in somewhat of an admission that they're having a hard time drafting and develop wideouts. But I love your point about coaching, because Eagles, Patriots, Browns, who do they have? They have Bill Callahan, Jeff Stoutland. They had until recently Dante Scarnecchia. That's a great thing. And I think, we were talking about sports, we were talking about sports betting and the evolution of, kind of trying to find an edge in a market that's incredibly tough to beat. And I think the coaching interaction is one that doesn't get enough play. Where you're looking at a team and you're saying this team has great coaches at certain positions, they're going to have a better opportunity to improve. I think that's where maybe you can get an edge this time of year. And that's really what Dan Bodine is saying. Are these teams really better at drafting those positions, or just better at developing? I think personally, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Thomas, I think the media and just like draft evaluators in general that aren't on the outside and don't have access to all the information, we much, much more heavily index on the actual drafting than the actual development. And I think part of that is because development has been diminished at the NFL level because of the rookie deals being 4 years and them being cheap. And so if you don't hit on a Zach Wilson, you can move on almost right away. And I think that we do underrate in the marketplace, whether we're talking about fantasy or betting or just generally analyzing the NFL. I do think we struggle at incorporating the idea of development.
Yeah, look, Dan, it's a really good question. It's a good point. We can argue it up and down, and the reality is you have to have the right coaches. I don't care if they're the best schemers, if they're the best on the board in their meeting rooms, and they're good leaders. If they're not developing the players, you have no chance to thrive, in my mind, as a team. And I would say you also have to take in consideration the fact of the rules in today's world, right? 15, 20 years ago, man, these guys were pounding it. I'm not saying I'm for the beating up of the football players in training camps and in practices, but you can only imagine along the offensive and defensive line, if you're not coming off the ball that you're used to coming off the ball, to get the real live looks. Same with gaming, like when you're setting up your run. If you're not running hard, you're not running, full speed or close to full speed, you're never going to be hitting it on all cylinders, of course. And then when you get out into the games, things are coming up short. So the development of the players has something to do with the coaches for sure, as I mentioned earlier, but it also has to do with how you're approaching it. Some teams, unfortunately, Eric, this is crazy, they will come right up to the line on the rules, right? And maybe even cross it. And they will figure if they cross it and they get fined, so be it. They got an extra whatever, so many days practicing harder than they should have or crossing the lines, but they got out of it. I've always watched that closely. When I was a general manager, I used to watch the teams that would get fined, and I'm like, how are these guys literally getting away with it? Are they going to their owner saying, hey, do we have a fund here for $250,000 or $500,000 a year? I'm being facetious here, where if we get popped for crossing the line, so be it. We're training our players harder. We're getting them ready. See how close to the line we can come. That's unfortunate, but I'm sure it happens.
Yeah, Ryan talking. Bill Callahan was with the Cowboys when he developed Tyron Smith, Travis Frederick, and Zach Martin. So as usual, you're on the ball there. I actually just had an idea thinking about something for our prediction model, and I messaged that to Tej because I was like, Tom, you're making a good point. And I'm like, this is how math is done, Thomas. The subject matter expert says something, and a math guy's like, I want to use that, and sends it to his math guy. So, no, that's awesome. That's a really cool. And I agree. Like, look, one thing to think about, the Packers, when Rodgers was the quarterback there, it was always this thing about, let's look at, let's look at these contrasts. The Packers, when he was the quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, the last 2 or 3 years, never played in the preseason, and they always got off to a small start. They got beat to sleep against the New Orleans Saints in 2021. They got killed by the Vikings in Week 1 last year, and you wonder, right? Whereas, who's the best Week 1 passer in the history of the NFL? It's Patrick Mahomes. Now, granted, he's one of the best passers in the NFL history anyway. But what do the Chiefs do? They play their guys in the preseason, and they hit, and everybody talks about that. And that is something I hesitate to take broad conclusions, but you look at some of the anecdotes and it's like it makes a little bit of sense there. Go ahead.
Before we head on to Chicago, because I know we are going to go there, I do think we need to talk a little bit more about Trey Lance. Like, this is a big, big, big deal.
Yeah. I mean, it's the equivalent of you. I mean, it's the equivalent of you having to trade Julio after 2 years because he's not good enough, right? I mean, sure and like, let's back the truck up and say, what if that were to, like, you obviously don't have the counterfactual because he played and he was pretty good as a rookie. And then by year 2, he's one of the top receivers in the league. So you really didn't have to like really ponder anything. But what if you would have came out and been, because it's not like Trey Lance was bad as much as what the plan was to sit him in year 1, get him some NFL kind of look-sees, and then play him in year 2. And he gets injured in year 2, and other guys stepped up in his stead, and then he comes back, and yes, he wasn't great this preseason, but we're not talking about Zach Wilson here. We're not talking about a guy who's played a lot and struggled. We're talking about a guy who's rarely played and struggled, and then behind the scenes, the information must have been much worse than what we were seeing publicly.
Okay, let's start with context here for everyone. This is, when I say it's a big, big, big deal, 3 bigs, it's a big, big, big deal because you're not talking about a bunch of lame-o people running the organization kind of on their way out. You're talking about one of the better head coaches, top-tier head coaches, pure head coach, and you're talking about a very, very good football man in John Lynch, right? So you're talking about a team and ownership who puts it out there. This is a really good organization. For context, I'm just saying you can sit there and say, well, if it were just to be some other people who are randoms that they made a move like this, but this happened with a group that is really good and knows what they're doing. So I think for everyone, when you get fan bases out there throwing darts at their general managers and their head coaches because they're not thinking straight, this can even happen with an organization that is on top of it. So let's talk about that a little bit because that's an important concept.
Well, I don't even think that. I think you're right, and I think that it draws you to the reason why it was able to actually happen, because they have the cachet. I mean, this is like and again, I'm gonna couch everything I say with John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan have done a phenomenal job. They've taken this team to a Super Bowl and 2 other NFC title games. They failed on this pick, and in Trey Lance's 2 years in San Francisco, they've made 2 conference title games. Isn't that crazy? Like, they're moving off of a mistake despite team success.
Did you see Peter King's comments, your buddy? I love Peter too. I mean, he ripped Kyle. Interesting, he didn't rip John at all. I'm just surprised that it all went to Kyle, probably because Kyle is the quarterback guru. But what I think is important here is, so you let's start going backward, right? 10 or 15 years ago, if you were making a move on your first round, top 5 quarterback, how many have over the last 5 or 8 years? We've seen some of the best GMs in this league, and some not as well regarded, but are really good personnel people, move on from their first round quarterback. By the way, I look back sometimes and I only laugh. If I would have missed on Matt Ryan in 2 years, I probably would have been gone. But that's
I think Thomas, you bring up the point, right? Which is, in some ways, so I think this is provided that the manger for these 2 men, though, because in their first year they passed on Patrick Mahomes for Solomon Thomas. Yeah. Like, this is not the first time. Like, and that was that Brian Hoyer was on the roster. It wasn't some imaginary, like, oh, they had a guy there. And by 19, they're in the Super Bowl, and they traded DeForest Buckner and got the pick for Javon Kinlaw. That didn't work either. And you think about how many mistakes that they've made. I don't think it's more mistakes than the average team. It's just that what they've hit on when they've done good things has been enormous. And they've gotten the runway to have, when they both signed their deals, everybody talked about how they had 6-year deals together, because that Niners team, if people forget this, when they moved on from Jim Harbaugh, it went Jim Tom Sula 1 year, Chip Kelly 1 year. And so they wanted to make sure they gave the people the runway for being able to do it. And to your point, like, Thomas, if Matt Ryan would have flopped, I'm guessing the Falcons would have moved. Who knows, right? I mean, your other picks did great too, but but who knows if they would have stayed. But this team, in some ways, the Niners built up a team so good that they felt the quarterback was the next piece, and they were wrong. And their team was still so good that they could still win with that mistake. And they've been able to do that despite a lot of mistakes, which has been kind of funny. And I think that's the same thing about a lot of, Bill Belichick for 10 years really has not had as much luck on the draft as his first. And maybe some of that might have been, his director of college scouting was a different guy, but it might have, I'm looking for a smirk there, Thomas.
That's a good one. I got it.
But I think that the longer that a guy is in charge, the more mistakes or more things that don't work out for him come up, and it makes you go back and appreciate the other team building aspects that they had. So it's a big issue for the Niners, but they've done enough to build themselves the opportunity to get off this, much like Howie was able to get off of Carson Wentz. Similar ideas where you're able to cut bait on these things when you have success. It's almost this like double whammy of privilege there.
Well, I mean, who was it? Let's talk about. So Howie, you mentioned there. You talk about Les Snead, right? Les and what they did. You talk about Joe Douglas is in a spot right now. It's going to be, it's who knows how it plays out. all of those guys are really good at what they do, whatever, however people judge them, right? I just want to come back to the fact that it's not an exact science. Oh, and oh, by the way, do I want to fold back into Sumer Sports and how it's not an exact science? Ergo, why not utilize an augmentation tool that's going to help the percentages? It's not going to be perfect. We know that. But that is something that we all understand. There's so much data out there. We need to start tapping into it now. And interestingly enough, I feel that owners are a lot more understanding of this right now than they used to be. And although I still do believe that you are gauged off your ability to pick quarterbacks adeptly and not only pick them, but find replacements and move on when the time is to move on. Howie moved on when the time was moved on. He is still considered one of the top 2, 3, or 4 GMs in the league.
You saw that that when they were in Houston last year for Thursday Night Football, one of the fans was like, "Howie, are you going to apologize for the Jalen Reagor pick?" Because they took Jalen Reagor over Justin Jefferson, and he turns around, he's like, "I brought you to the Super Bowl." Like, yeah. and again, and this is me, like, the Eagles, even though they made the blunder and the Vikings got Jefferson, who's the second best player in the league, in my opinion, it's about your other selections, right? Be such a well-rounded GM that any one pick doesn't kill you, right? And I think that that's what Howie has nailed and the Niners have nailed. Now, one question I have, because our friend Peter, you know, in his Monday Morning Quarterback was not complimentary. I mean, he was very scathing. I know a lot of people, like, for example, your friend Lombardi, Michael Lombardi, was also giving out information that he thought that it was Mac Jones, and how much of this is the fact that the Niners either not lied to the media. I'm not saying that, but the Niners did not show their hand to any media that year. And as such, when this thing goes down, they don't have the one person coming out of the woodwork being like, "Oh, but you know, like," because I look, and she's a friend of mine, so I'll say it, like, Jordan Rodriguez writes for The Athletic, and she's given great access to the Rams. And I think when you read her articles, you're like, that's a person who's plugged in and oftentimes will get the reasoning for all these moves ahead of time so that they can sort of soften. And there's been times, Thomas, when somebody in the league has been like, "Look, we're doing this. I need you to explain this on Twitter, your podcast and stuff." Like, I've had that happen to me, and I'm just me. Like, and so I wonder if the 49ers, the reason they drafted Trey Lance is still basically opaque to the whole media. Is there a lack of, not empathy is the wrong word, but like, there aren't any people coming in and defending them? And do you think that that's because they decided to be so secretive with what they're doing with the third pick?
It could be. I feel like there's a lot that, yes. I mean, yes, to answer your question, I do believe that. I mean, Peter King, of course, is dialed in with everyone. He has really good relationships with most people. He's not a guy that's throwing stuff, but he is outspoken at times when it's time to be outspoken. And I respect the hell out of him for that. You know, I started thinking a lot about this as well, though. Not only the privacy side of it and the secretive sort of, I don't even know if it's the clandestine is the right word. Make no mistake about it, brother, because I've been around this. When there's a mistake within an organization, there are people within that organization who truly went to the well for that person, and they slam the table. They're not always necessarily the top guys. There are people in that organization right now that are praying that it doesn't get out who truly was the biggest supporter of Trey Lance. Because if it does get out that they can pin it to someone, then of course the media does their thing. Everyone rolls on it. And will that prevent that person from having an opportunity to be a general manager? Because it is such a big deal. They are claiming that this is this second or is this the worst quarterback deal? I think they were talking about the trade for Russell Wilson was the biggest blunder. This was someone that was talking about it recently. I won't even give the guy credit. Is this a bigger blunder than the Russell Wilson acquisition? I know it's college and pro. In your mind as an analyst, statistician, unbelievable mathematical genius that you are, what's more of a blunder?
It's the Wilson one, just because of the way, you tied so much money to it, and it sort of prevented you from doing a lot of things. I'm going to propose a third option though. The San Diego Chargers in 1998 moved up from pick 3 to pick 2, and they traded 2 1s, a 2, a 3, Eric Metcalf, who's a legend of the game, and got Ryan Leaf. And that's another one where you're like, that's tough. I know it's sort of a weird thing, but in 1990, the Colts moved up from, I think, the Colts traded Chris Hinton, Andre Rison, so 2 All-Pros, and a couple other things for Jeff George's pick. And that was a pretty rough one as well, because they won like 30% of the games. This one's up there. I'm never going to fault a team for taking a shot on a young quarterback, though. I think the Lance one is interesting because he has almost no data. And so you can make an argument that you just have a weaker case to make for the player. But I would never when the Eagles went up and got Wentz, when the Rams went up and got Goff, when the Chiefs went up and got Mahomes, man, if you hit on that quarterback, it's just a different game. Imagine if Lance was a 7 out of 10, this team's a Super Bowl favorite every year.
So you say you'll never fault anyone. I won't fault anyone for having the nuts to do what they need to do. Believe me, I'm a be aggressive when it's time to be aggressive. The only thing that when I step back and I look at situations where you're talking about lower level competition and you're talking about not, how many reps that they had, whatever that plays out to, where you're like, I don't really care because I see this player being unbelievably athletic and et cetera. That's where, okay, you might hit, but I have always felt this way. Put this stuff aside. I used to argue with a lot of the scouts that we, over the years we were growing up, and I have some really good friends who would take shots and talk about people in our draft rooms about this guy's amazing. And they might miss on 9 out of 10 and hit on 1 out of 10. The 1 out of 10, they hung on for another 10 years because they hit on that guy. And I don't believe in that. I believe you need consistency in your approach, and you need to look at all things that you're looking at, not just the athleticism and the height, weight, speed, jump stuff, but truly the entire platform to make your decision. Let me come back for a second here. And I would say, back to what we're talking about with San Francisco, there are people within that building that are worried that it doesn't get out, that it's publicized who the massive supporter was. In the end, it doesn't matter for that group, and they know that. It's the organization pick. It was everyone involved, and that's the way that it should be, on the good ones and the bad ones. Unfortunately, believe me, there will be someone trying to dig that out, and it'll end up in Mike Florio's, his report in the near future, who was the big supporter. And it's unfortunate because it should go towards
and we know that that's true because people use it the other way, right? And I think Brett Veach is a fantastic general manager for the Chiefs. Don't get me wrong, but when the Chiefs were struggling to draft players for about 2-3 years, it always came up that Brett Veach was the guy that pounded the table for Mahomes because it was used as capital, right? Because the Chiefs had some, not so productive drafts in 2018 and 2019. So the other side of the coin is the same thing, right? Somebody's going to use it against that person if and when they ever can, because we know that information exists within buildings because people will use it for somebody they're trying to protect when the time comes. It's very interesting. To your point about going 1 for 10, I think at quarterback, it's tough because when you're a normally constructed NFL team, you hit on a quarterback, then a lot of sins are forgiven. And yet I think with the 49ers, the way that they're constructed, the rest of their roster and their coach was always such that a quarterback was just a driver of the car and not the whole vehicle. And I feel like they deviated a little bit in going with Lance, who in the ceiling was that Mahomes, everything, everywhere, all at once quarterback, when in reality, I actually somewhat believe the reports that they like Lance too, or not Lance, Mac Jones too, because Mac is kind of the car driver, and the same way that Brock Purdy's the car driver. And I think the quarterback for the Niners is Kyle Shanahan. And I think that's, when your team is constructed differently than everybody else's, and I think that theirs is, you have to draft differently than everybody else too, because otherwise the mistakes are magnified like this. And again, we throw all this up. The Niners are the second favorite in the NFC to make the Super Bowl this year. They have a win total. They're favorites in their own division by quite a bit. They're a good franchise that whiffed on a quarterback. And frankly, I think they're getting too much flack for it, because you got to go back and say all the stuff they hit on. At the same time, I do think that it's something to learn from. It's interesting. We have a Chiefs fan, Ryan, here, who says, who is behind the Clyde Edwards-Helaire pick? We don't talk about that draft pick anymore. Okay.
I'm going to just say last thing on that. Yes, John Lynch, Kyle Shanahan, top notch in what they do. Yes, they're going to make mistakes. This, of course, was a mistake. They've admitted to it. They've also hit on a really good quarterback and up-and-comer in Brock Purdy. So give them their due that way, of course, which is really important. The problem is people out there are now looking, right? They're going to look and they're going to say, okay, what about the last 10 years first-round draft picks of the 49ers? Whatever they're looking at, they're going to be throwing their darts in whatever way and yet look how successful they've been, right? It's not just about draft picks. Sometimes you hit, sometimes you don't. Not an exact science. How you're putting together your team, how you're building your team, how you're leading your team. I mean, two really, really smart football men. We'll see how it plays out, of course. They're confident. They have big cojones, both of them. They'll weather the storm.
Yeah, happy for Dallas too, because I think that, they've needed a backup the last 2 years, and luckily Cooper Rush has won 5 of the 6 starts he's started, because I think Mike McCarthy's a very good coach, underrated. But it's cool also to have a backup plan there. I kind of wished for Kwesi's sake that he would have traded for him, but Kwesi now has a tough decision to make because they don't really have a young player in the wings, and Kirk Cousins is on the final year of his deal. Speaking of that division, by the way, hell of a segue, Eric. We're going to go to Chicago briefly because I know we're running short on time, but the people like this discussion. I just wanted to talk, let's 5-6 minutes on the Chicago Bears, because I have a friend in the league who we talk about teams, and he always tells me it's a lot easier to tear it down than it is to build it up. And so, I think when you look at the NFC North, you had 2 teams that got new general managers about the same time. The Vikings went the competitive rebuild and they won 13 games, and now they're dealing with kind of roster issues now. The Bears went the Detroit Lions route and said, a year earlier, of course, with Brad Holmes, and said, God, there's not a lot here. Let's sell off some parts. Let's rebuild. Let's lose some games, and let's get a draft pick. They turned the draft pick into DJ Moore and a bunch of other draft picks. And now they're sitting at year 2, Thomas, and they are a win total of 7.5 on the betting market. They have a higher chance, about a little bit shy of 4-1, to win the division. They have a higher chance of winning the division per the betting markets than do the Packers, who have won the division more than all the other teams combined over the last 20 years. When I look at this team, I'm thinking, again, a lot harder to build it up than to tear it down. But I kind of like what Ryan Poles is doing out of one side of my mouth. And then the other side of my mouth, I say, I still don't know if it's enough to win this year. So to me, it's a really interesting dynamic, because they clearly have time and they're clearly using time. But I think Chicago fans think they're going to be good this year.
So they think they're going to be good this year. That's going to be interesting to see. I mean, I hope they are. I still, I have such a soft spot for Ryan Pace, because I really like Ryan as a person. And I know Ryan's down here in Atlanta now working a lot of magic, I think, because I think he's a very good personnel man. Now, don't let me get off on this. So you bring it back to Chicago and what you're thinking, because I do think they have the ability, but it's not easy to just jump right back into, 7, 8, 9 games. Your chart there, by the way, did you bring it up yet? No, you haven't. Is it worth you bringing up that for a minute? Just so
the probabilities of each.
Yeah. Can you bring it up for a second?
I'll pull it up here.
Please.
Sumersports.com.
Yeah.
All right. Let me present that here. Actually, I'm just going to share our actual website here with the league table. Go to Sumersports.com. Here we have, by the way, as wished for by Thomas Dimitroff, we have the top row here, staying put as we go here. So here's the Chicago Bears right here, where they're at. So they're, power rating is kind of right around the bottom end, but because of the schedule, which is below average, if you look at the right-hand side here, 1496, it's a little less than the league average of 1505. So they have a little bit easier schedule. But yeah, we put them at about 7.3 wins, which is a little bit underneath where the market has them at 7.5, but fairly close there. And as you can see, a 30% chance to make the playoffs, about a 16% chance. So we would put them more at 5-1 to win the division, and so on, and about a 5% chance to earn the first pick. Notice here the Cardinals, after they cut Colt McCoy today, are leading the pack for the first overall pick, which I don't know. I don't think anybody's going to argue with.
Fields, we have not talked. I don't know where your head is on him right now. This is a big year, right? We want to see how he plays out. Okay, go figure.
Yeah, so we have Justin Fields here. Notice Justin Fields, Thomas, expected points added is basically a way of giving every single play on the field a value. So, for example, a pick six is worth minus 12 points for the offense. A touchdown, depending upon where you score, it could be anywhere worth from a couple points to 6 points, depending upon where you are. Justin Fields, Thomas, as a passer, cost his team, or their passing game cost the team about 66 points. But Justin Fields himself as a runner gained back about 65 of those points. Wow. Now, This is an offensive league, so you want, like, when you look at the top end guys in passing EPA, Mahomes, that's 192 points to the good, 23 rushing. Jared Goff, and I think a lot of us, that's why I hesitate to say the passer is accounting for all this. It's the passing offense. But Jared Goff, Josh Allen, they're adding 100 points to their team just by throwing the football. That's something where Justin Fields is going to have to improve, or else it's going to be a tough season for the Bears.
By the way, leading in, when will this turn over to 23? Not preseason, right? You didn't do anything preseason-wise.
Yeah, so this will be the Monday or Tuesday after the first week. We'll have all of this up there for you so that you can monitor it as the season progresses.
And we're talking about quarterbacks. We're talking about the teams. When will we fold in the other positions? The other, let's say, fantasy positions.
Yeah, so we're going to do that beginning of this month. So early September. So September before the first game. Let's just say that.
Okay. While we're educating, who comes up with all the metrics on the top? Is that you and Sean Clement? Is that you and Steve Santiago, our dude? Who is it?
A lot of it is traditional stuff like touchdowns and interceptions are just what people want. In fact, Chase Falavine, our cap guy, was the one that told us to put yards per pass attempt up here because we didn't have that. EPA is something that, the community, the analytics community, long before PFF or Sumer ever built or something like that. So we're adding that. But a lot of it, Thomas, is just like what's called data exploration or exploratory data analysis, where we're going through and saying what helps teams win football games. And these are variables that are correlated with that.
So what's interesting, and a lot of your group will probably be, our listeners will be interested to hear, oftentimes a general manager, use that as an example, or a senior level personnel person might not know all elements of what's presented in some of these, data analytically driven charts and forms out there. So being able to educate people is an important part, not only of Sumer Sports, but in general. The more you educate people on data and analytics and the use, the better it will be. The more in 5, 6, 7 years, this league is going to be thriving in that area, I believe. And I have my own feelings about that another time, another place, but you're doing a hell of a job with this. I love what we have here.
So notice something here, Thomas, before we finish the Fields discussion. Notice he had one of the highest sack rates. So this is sacks as a percentage of dropbacks. That's where a lot of that minus 65 is coming from. He didn't throw. I mean, you're not talking about a guy that threw 20 interceptions. You're talking about a guy that took a lot of sacks. And a sack, Thomas, is worth about 2 points to the defense. So if you think about, going all the way back here, a lot of this minus 65, that's due to sacks. And, sack rate is one of the more important things that translates from college to pro. It was something that was an issue with Fields and Watson when they were, rising up. It's always been an issue with Russell Wilson. Baker Mayfield, as you can imagine, he's struggled as a processor. Ryan Tannehill's always been a guy that's taken a lot of sacks. And granted, Tannehill, generally speaking, is generally good enough to overcome that as a thrower. But it is something to monitor. A lot of people look at passer rating, but one thing passer rating doesn't have, Thomas, is sacks taken, and sacks, matter, right? A ton. And that was one thing, when you think about, just transitioning here to, if you're going to be bearish on the Bears, meaning you want to sell them and take a team like Green Bay or Minnesota or Detroit, it is because Fields, while very accurate, has always struggled with taking too many sacks. And this offensive line, they got Darnell Wright, but Tevin Jenkins is out for a while. It's a team where I think I like what they're doing off the line of scrimmage. I liked DJ Moore. DJ was the first wide receiver drafted the year that you took Ridley. I like Fields kind of. I like Rashawn Johnson. I like some of the talented, and then on defense I like Jaquan Brisker. I like Kyler Gordon. I like the linebackers they brought in. They only had 20 sacks last year, and they bring in Ngakoue. I just don't know if on either side of the ball, offensive or defensive line, can they be good enough to play a 17-game season at the level it's going to be necessary for them to make the playoffs. That to me is the one worry. And this isn't a ding on Poles, because I'm gonna take back to a guy we like quite a bit at Duke Tobin in Cincy. What was the last thing that Duke Tobin built on the Cincy team? It was the offensive line, because sometimes you get the quarterback and all those guys in place just to even let you know if it's worth it, right? And I think for the Bears, they're trying to find out if Fields and company are worth it, because an offensive line is a huge investment. It's 5 players, and they're all going to be making decent money or draft capital. And so, as much as I don't think the Bears are going to be good enough or sturdy enough to win this year, I think that they are still. I wouldn't put it as a black mark in their team building process.
Perfectly said. At 52 minutes and 07 seconds.
Right.
I'll let you finish with that.
Yeah. So I'm excited to watch the Bears. I think even week 1 they're favored against Green Bay. That's a game I think we're going to be watching at the office. I'm just excited about them. I'm always rooting for Ryan Poles. I think he's a good person, and I think he's got a decent head on his shoulders, and I think he's building this thing up. But I don't think it'll be as easy as Bears fans think it is, and so it'll be fun to watch them. I hope they prove me wrong, frankly. So all right, at 52 minutes, Thomas, we went long today, but I think it was worth it. We got to talk about kickers. We got to talk about Trey Lance. We got to talk about the Bears. We got to preview Sumer Sports. So for all of you that enjoyed it, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. We want to thank our sponsor for the past few months, Circa Sports, for all their support of our endeavors here at Sumer. Sumersports.com for all of your football needs in the fall. So for Thomas Dimitrov, this has been Eric Eager. This has been the Sumer Sports Show.